Hi, my name is Lynn Lathowers, and this is a video about podcasts that I am doing for my technology class at Simpson University. We're talking about 5 different podcasts. The first one I'll be talking about is from a group called Whole Brain Teaching. This episode is about blurting out in the classroom, and it's hosted by Laura Forbane and Rhonda Arl. And they have their guest speaker is a man named Coach B, which he, I guess, comes on these quite a bit. They're beginning to talk about, statistics about blurting in classroom, and that in very many typical classrooms, there's a blurt every 30 seconds. They start out by saying they're going to give you 8 different, strategies to use to do blurting. They don't, but their first one is, ignore the blurters. Right? Because if you acknowledge them, you're just giving them permission to blurt. And they say, they have a strategy about, raising their hand. Raise your hand and just stare at them until they get the idea. They also have a certain thing that they use from a book that the man wrote. They also say to develop, more engaging or highly engaging lessons, and that could reduce blurting. The rest of the podcast seems to be talking about a game and that they play, and other things that they describe in a book that the man wrote. So it did kind of lose my interest at the end. The second podcast was from a group called 10-Minute Teacher Podcast. This episode was on how to use data instruction in everyday instruction. The host was a Vicki Davis, and her guest was a Victoria Sotero, who is a data analytic person in New York. She talks about warm and cold data, the cold data being things you can measure, such as, absences, demographics, and the warm data as being the why for those. She uses an example such as absenteeism, and that teachers can take this data, they can find out the why. A lot of times the why is they don't have a car, they're sick, they don't have any clean clothes, they're not able to do laundry. She says that teachers, educators need to be given time to go over the data, to discuss the data, and also to be given permission to act on this data in order to make it useful in the classroom. The next podcast is also through the 10-Minute Teacher Podcast, and her guest this time was a lady named Jamie Donnelly, and the title was 12 AR apps and tips for awesome classrooms. The woman has a blog, and it's called arvrinedu.com. That was one of her tips, to go on there to learn about it in education, her blog. And then she talked about other things like something called Lumina AI, where you scan something in, and then she talked about printing it out and then putting the scan on something called MergeCube. And then she talked about using that scan in some CoSpace, and then being able to build spaces with your 3D objects after you put them in CoSpace on something called Mozilla Hubs. And something called Spatial to create the 3D experience. And then you can also create 3D avatars in something called Ready Player Me. You can make your avatars talk in something called Deep Motion. And she also talked about GeoGeek AR to teach geography, which I've actually seen a little bit of. It's kind of cool. And something called Adobe Aero. And she suggests that these are great to help learning diversity styles of kids in the classroom. The next podcast, she talks about how do you help kids with ADHD succeed in school and life. And she interviewed a woman named Nicole Biscotti, who wrote a book using her son's journals called I Can Learn in School While I'm Moving. I'm going to school with ADHD. And she talks about the misunderstandings. Teachers go, why can't this kid just sit still? But basically, it's not the child's fault. Brain scans show that their brains are different. She talks about her journey, and her son saying that, Mom, I can't focus because I hear everything. It's not focusing on the teacher, it's focusing on everything. And she talks about whole class accommodations, not just student accommodations, where you can have visual cues, support, doing movements, different types of student choice, and something called executive functioning, which helps kids organize. And I found this podcast quite useful, and I would like to do some more research on it because I do have kids who are very unorganized in my class. So the next podcast is called How We Use the EEE Framework for Educational Technology Evaluations. And they talked to a woman named Dr. Liz Kolb, who developed the EEE framework. And the EEE framework includes engagement, enhancement, and extension, which is used in science and technology to get students with their learning objective goals. She talks a lot about technology that's around VR, AI, and her framework is used to evaluate teachers and how they use the technology in the classroom. Are they meeting the learning goals? Is the technology meeting the learning goals of the students? Because if it doesn't help the learning objective, then it's not useful in the classroom. She says that there's no bad tool, technology tool, and just because it's old doesn't mean it's not effective, and just because it's new doesn't mean it is effective. And you can go to EEEframework.com to learn more about it.